Hi everybody, this is Dr. Childs, and in this presentation I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to write successful introductory and concluding paragraphs. While we're talking about this, you may want to have in front of you the sample introduction and concluding paragraphs that I've provided for you. It's right here in this folder within the module, and so if you want to download those and print those while you're watching this presentation, that's not a bad idea. To start out with the introduction, an introductory paragraph needs to accomplish these three main goals. It should capture the reader's interest, preferably in the first sentence or two. It should provide background information about the topic, and it should state the thesis. In general, that thesis statement should be the last sentence in the first paragraph, and the first part of the intro should capture the reader's interest and provide the reader with enough information so he or she understands the thesis statement. And so you've got to provide that background information, and so the reader sees the thesis statement as interesting and relevant. These are the big don'ts for writing an introductory paragraph. Don't be boring. Do not talk about your thought process in coming up with the assignment. Like, well, I had to write an iSearch paper, and I brainstormed, and then I thought of 3 different topics, and then I finally narrowed it down to a topic about how to get my daughter to quit sucking her thumb. So don't go through your whole thought process in coming up with the assignment. A lot of people start their intro that way, and it isn't interesting. Don't be gimmicky. In other words, don't try to do something cutesy or attention-getting that ends up being just annoying. And the best example I have of that is a student once who came to me with an idea for his introductory paragraph, and he said, so I figured out what my first sentence is going to be. It's going to say, I'm going to kill you. And then he just looked at me expectantly, and was like, isn't that good? And realistically, in what context is I'm going to kill you going to be an attention-getting sentence? It just seems out of context. And so you want to avoid doing anything gimmicky just for attention for the sake of attention. Don't make a sweeping generalization like, since the beginning of time, parents have tried to bring up their children well. Even if it's true, it's not very interesting. Also, don't fail to enable the reader to understand the thesis. This sounds kind of complicated, but I do want you to understand that if the reader can't understand the thesis, often it's because the introductory paragraph has not provided enough background information, enough context to help that reader understand what the thesis means and why it matters. So you have all these don'ts. What do you do instead? You want to use the intro, first of all, to answer the so what question when it comes to your thesis. Show your audience why the issue is worth reading about. Why is this a relevant or valuable topic? You can use the intro to include an attention-getting statistic or quotation. Something like 70% of all parents say they regret having had children. So, I don't know. Come up with something interesting and relevant to your topic. Also, you can tell an interesting anecdote. An anecdote is just a little story that is designed to prove a point or capture the interest of the reader. So you tell a little story about, your daughter telling too many lies or something, and you trying to teach her how not to do that. So usually a little narrative is something that people find interesting, and it helps draw them into the story, into your paper, Now, the concluding paragraph, in my opinion, is probably the most difficult to write in the paper because there isn't any clear formula, there isn't any clear list of jobs that the conclusion has to do like there is for the intro. In general, the conclusion should give the reader a feeling of completeness or finality. So kind of like, okay, this paper is over, it is complete, it has said something. Don't just suddenly stop your paper. It needs to have a clear, distinct concluding paragraph. The conclusion does need to give closure. It needs to make the reader feel like, okay, this paper is over. You don't just leave the reader hanging. Never have like a cliffhanger conclusion. It doesn't work very well in essays. The conclusion should leave the reader with something interesting to consider. You want your paper to linger in the reader's mind as long as possible. You want it to kind of stick in their memory. And the best way to do that is to leave them with some thought-provoking question or topic. Don't do any of these things. Don't repeat the thesis word for word. And in general, you want to be very careful about rewording the thesis. That's something that you may have been taught in high school to pass standardized tests. But in general, you don't have to repeat the thesis in the conclusion. Don't begin with a phrase like in conclusion or to conclude. It's just kind of clunky. And don't summarize your essay in the conclusion. The conclusion is not for summarizing. Most likely your paper has been very short, 3, 4, maybe 5 pages. And when your paper is that short, you don't need to restate what you've just said in your conclusion, because you should have said it well enough the first time that your reader will remember it. So do not summarize your essay in your conclusion, because that simply gets repetitive. Now, if you're not supposed to do that, what do? You can return to an idea in your intro. For instance, if you included a attention-getting statistic or quotation, you could return to that statistic or quotation and say something interesting about it that has been informed by the remainder of your paper. You could save a compelling detail or fact for the conclusion. Something shocking, surprising, memorable. If you don't need a shocking fact to actually support your thesis, then go ahead and save it as kind of a closer for your paper. You can also give a call to action, meaning that you encourage or exhort the reader to take action on what you were saying, what you were arguing for, what you were informing them about in your paper. If any of this sounds a little bit vague, I really suggest that you take a look at the sample intro and concluding paragraphs that I provided for you to get a good idea of how this can be done successfully.